Sometimes you come to university and people talk about happiness, for example. They talk about positive psychology. I'm not a fan of positive psychology, by the way, because happiness is basically extroversion minus neuroticism, and we knew that 15 years ago, so we didn't need to make a lot of noise about it. So anyways, one of the things you might ask yourself is, well, why did you come to university? Did you actually come to university to make yourself happier? Well, let's think about that for a minute. Here's one thing to think about. We know if you put animals in a relatively boring situation, like rats in a boring situation, and you give them free access to cocaine, they'll just take cocaine until they're dead, basically. Now, rats in a normal environment won't do that, but bored rats that are sort of isolated, cocaine's really an excellent thing as far as they're concerned. They'll ignore sex, they'll ignore food. I think they'll still drink water, if I remember correctly, but it's cocaine all the way. And if you could inject an electrode into their minds, their brains, which people have done, you can inject the electrode down into the hypothalamus, into the part that's associated with the reward centers. It's the source of the dopaminergic tracts, and you can set them up so that if the rat pushes a button, they get a little jolt of happiness, basically, and the rat will sit there and push that happiness button in a rather frantic way, as if it's looking for something else in some sense, but it will certainly do it. It's because it's a peculiar kind of reward. Now the question might be, would you allow yourself to be wired up like that? Now you might think, there might be some times in your life where you think that might just be a perfectly fine idea, but most of you, I suppose, I presume, wouldn't do that for a second, for the same reasons perhaps that you don't avail yourself of unlimited access to cocaine, which is a stimulant that's very good at producing positive emotion. It's a powerful psychomotor stimulant. And so it affects the parts of your brain that are active when you're doing something that you think is worthwhile and productive. So why not just do that all the time? That's the question that Aldous Huxley asked in Brave New World. You've got everything you want, take a drug to keep you calm and happy, poof, perfect. Well, is that what you want? And if the answer is no, then you might ask yourself, what the hell do you want? Now, one of the things I've thought a lot about lately being 10 years, I suppose, is there are these statues that I've seen. I've looked at pictures of them online. They're statues of Atlas. Now, and Atlas is this god who has the world on his shoulders. And that's his destiny or his curse, is to have the world on his shoulders. And you might say, well, you know, poor Atlas, maybe he should just put the damn world down and, you know, go out for a beer or something. But then you might also think, well, what is that figure trying to, what is that idea trying to indicate? Because it's an old idea, it's a profound idea. There's something divine about a figure with the world on its shoulders. Well, I might say that's the reason you're in university, whether you know it or not. You're here to take the world on your shoulders because that's a sufficiently profound and worthwhile exercise so that all the suffering that you're going to have might be regarded as worthwhile. Because the value of what you're doing is so high. Because that's what you might ask. Is there something that you could do whose value is so high that the fact, and for the existentialists, it's a fact, that you're mortal and vulnerable and prone to suffering, inescapably, that you would find that not only acceptable, but desirable. You'd say, I'd pay that price. Well, that's an existential question. You might say that's the existential question. And one of the things that's very interesting about that question is, and we're going to talk about this a lot next class, is what happens if you make the opposite choice? Well, I think the 20th century actually showed us what happened when people made the opposite choice. Because as far as I can tell, when people abandoned their divine responsibility, let's say, to the utopian claims of a totalitarian state or to hopeless nihilism, the consequence on the one hand with nihilism was despair and illness, and the consequence on the totalitarian end of things, the utopian end, was that, well, you might not die, but you're certainly going to have a hand in making sure that a lot of other people do. Well, it's sort of a Garden of Eden point. You know, what are people like? Imagine you could reconstruct a paradise on Earth. You know, hypothetically, that's what everyone wants. We could go live in the paradise and that would be the end of the problem. We'd all live happily ever after. But in the original paradise story, that's what people were provided with, and the first thing they did when they were put there was to do the one thing that they were told not to do that would bring it all crashing down. And that was immediately what they did. And so Dostoevsky's story is actually a retelling of that idea. The idea was that people aren't like the utopians think. We don't want it easy. We don't want it comfortable. We don't want it good. And the reason for that is we'd be bored stiff. And so that if anybody ever did put us in the kind of nursery that would require us never to exert any effort to do anything at all whatsoever ever again, even if it meant going insane, we'd destroy it. And then he takes that further. He says, and that's a good thing. Kierkegaard, writing earlier, about 40 years earlier, said something quite similar. It is now about 4 years ago that I got the notion of wanting to try my luck as an author. I remember it quite clearly. It was on a Sunday. Yes, that's it, a Sunday afternoon. I was seated as usual, out of doors at the cafe in the Fredericksburg Garden. I had been a student for half a score of years. Although never lazy, all my activity nevertheless was like a glittering inactivity, a kind of occupation for which I still have a great partiality, and for which perhaps I even have a little genius. I read much, spent the remainder of the day idling and thinking, or thinking and idling, but that was all it came to. So there I sat and smoked my cigar until I lapsed into thought. Among other thoughts, I remember these. You are going on, I said to myself, to become an old man, without being anything, and really without undertaking to do anything. On the other hand, wherever you look about you in literature and in life, you see the celebrated names and figures, the precious and much heralded men who are coming into prominence and are much talked about, the many benefactors of the age who know how to benefit mankind by making life easier and easier, some by railways, others by omnibuses and steamboats, others by the telegraph, others by easily apprehended compendiums and short recitals of everything worth knowing. And finally, the true benefactors of the age who make spiritual existence, in virtue of thought, easier and easier, yet more and more significant. And what are you doing? Here my soliloquy was interrupted, for my cigar was smoked out and a new one had to be lit. So I smoked again, and then suddenly this thought flashed through my mind. You must do something. But inasmuch as with your limited capacities it will be impossible to make anything easier than it has become, you must, with the same humanitarian enthusiasm as the others, undertake to make something harder. This notion pleased me immensely, and at the same time it flattered me to think that I, like the rest of them, would be loved and esteemed by the whole community. For when all combine in every way to make everything easier, there remains only one possible danger. Namely, that the ease becomes so great that it becomes altogether too great. And then there's only one want left, though it is not yet a felt want, when people will want difficulty. Out of love for mankind and out of despair at my embarrassing situation, seeing that I had accomplished nothing and was unable to make anything easier than it had already been made, and moved by a genuine interest in those who make everything easy, I conceived it as my task to create difficulties everywhere.